up right where we left off last week. You might remember, if you were here, that Jesus said that if we are truly Christ followers, that's another word for disciples, students of Jesus, followers of Christ, that, and here's what we learned last week, that we will always choose Jesus as our highest priority. That we will choose Jesus as a priority over family, over education, over our work, even over our spouse, over our investments in retirement, over all of our lives, that He is our highest priority. Now, if you did not get a chance to watch last week, I really encourage you to go online to thechurchrequel.org and click on sermons and watch last week, because today is really just kind of a continuation, and the two just kind of fit together. Now, it's important that we recognize and that we remind ourselves that Jesus is not saying that we cannot love anything or anyone else if we love Jesus. That's not what He's saying. He simply says that we cannot love anything or anyone else more than what we love Jesus. That He needs to be and should be, and it's right for Him to be, the highest priority in our lives. So I thought through this week some signs that Jesus might not be the highest priority in your life or in my life. Let me just kind of run through some of these signs and see what you think. Do you have this kind of playing in your mind? That there are Jesus things and there are secular things, and I can keep them separate. I've got my secular life and I've got my sacred life. And in my sacred life, Jesus is number one, but in my secular life, I've got these other priorities over here. You know, that would be a sign that maybe Jesus is not the highest priority in my life. Or do you have this playing in your mind, that I might miss out on something if I make Jesus the highest priority? That would be a sign that maybe there's something else to you really that's more important than Jesus. Or this, do you have this thought kind of playing also in your head, that two people could share my highest priority? You know, there's Jesus and, well, anytime it's Jesus and, you've got a problem, because that means that Jesus is not the highest priority. So I want you to just kind of think of that, keep that in the back of your mind as we go through the rest of the talk today. We're going to come back to that before the end of our talk. Now, Jesus today continues the theme that we started last week with these words in verse 27, Luke 14:27. Anyone who does not carry his cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Now, to be honest with you, those words make us kind of uncomfortable, because we're not folks who typically see anyone carrying a cross. In fact, if we do occasionally see somebody going down the road carrying a cross on their shoulder, we think that's weird, right? I mean, let's be honest with you. So what does it really mean here? You know, when the people heard Jesus say that, they were accustomed to the Roman rule. They knew that when they would come into town, along the road for the last mile or so coming into town, there would be crosses and sometimes even people on those crosses who would be paying the ultimate sacrificial penalty for their crimes. And so in that day, if somebody said, you must carry your cross, that meant, yeah, that's the end, and that's where I'm heading to, and there's nothing more important to me today than this, even though this is not where I want to go and what I want to do. So the challenge for a teacher-preacher in the year 2017 is to say, when we hear these words, carry your cross, what is it that Jesus is actually saying to us? And I think of three things. Let's write these down. If you're a filler in or a blanker, this is the first filler in of your blanker, all right? And that is, number one, self-denial. Self-denial. In Matthew 19, Jesus says this, and everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or children or farms for my name's sake will receive many times as much and will inherit eternal life. Self-denial. Self-denial is really another way of saying what is the opposite of selfishness. And by nature, we are all selfish. We all want what we want. Self-denial is when I choose other than my natural inclination. And so self-denial, by its very nature, is very highly intentional. I intend to do what we learned a couple weeks ago, the opposite of what my normal inclination is. Because you're never naturally going to choose Jesus over the other things, the other people, the other relationships, the other opportunities that are naturally attracted to you. If you're not intentional about it, you will simply go where your natural inclination is, to the priorities that are naturally attractive to you. If you don't think about it, you will actually deceive yourself. The Bible tells us that we can actually deceive ourselves. If you don't think about it, you'll deceive yourself into thinking, well, this is okay. Jesus would approve. I'm not really saying no to Jesus. It's more of I'm saying yes to Jesus and something else. And we can't do both if we say that Jesus is my top priority. Self-denial. Denying to myself those things, those desires that may occur to me to be more attractive than what Jesus would be. But note this promise in this verse from Matthew 19:29, the promise that you will receive many times as much. There is a reward. I just want to leave that with you. There is a reward that is in store for us in heaven, many times more than anything that we ever give up when we choose Jesus first. So to take up my cross means self-denial. It also means, secondly, complete dedication. Complete dedication. Paul writes to the church at Corinth in chapter 9, and I love this from the Message version. All good athletes train hard. They do it for a gold medal that tarnishes and fades. You're after the one that's gold eternally. And I don't know about you, it's what Paul says, I don't know about you, but I'm running for the finish line. I'm running hard for the finish line. And here's the point, I'm giving it everything I've got. In another verse, it talks about straining towards the finish line. Now, anyone who has ever trained hard, as this refers to, if you've ever decided you have to get in shape, you ever decide you're going to start running, you just never accidentally back into that. It just never automatically happens. Brian here is laughing because he's been working really, really hard on that body lately. And it's not an accident, is it? Brian, right? You have to be intentional. It takes dedication. Choice, followed by action. Choice to decide I'm going to do something different, followed by action. Not just the intention, but the action. That this isn't my first natural inclination, but I'm going to do it anyway. And you find that it changes everything about you, including and especially your schedule. You see, if your schedule doesn't change, and you say that Jesus is your top priority, there's something wrong. Because if your schedule is the same as it's always been, if there's nothing different about where you go and what you do and how you live your life, then there's something wrong about saying that Jesus is my top priority. One of the authors that was significant in my life as I was a young man was a man by the name of Stephen Covey. Some of you may know him. He wrote the book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. He also wrote First Things First. So it's a book about priorities. And he understood the truth about priorities when he said this, that the key is not to prioritize what's on your schedule, but to schedule your priorities. Now, let me say that again because there's some great wisdom there. And if you're struggling with this idea of complete dedication and your schedule, maybe this is something to think about. That the key is not to prioritize what's on your schedule, not to say, well, let me get my schedule in the right order. No, it's to schedule your priorities, to say, hey, what's really important to me, and make that your schedule. If you're taking up your cross daily to follow Jesus, then Jesus will be your priority and your schedule every day. That's complete dedication. Another preacher I heard who was talking about this once told me that, people are worried sometimes about somehow how they can cram and squeeze Jesus into their schedule because they're so busy. How are they ever going to do that? He said that's not the solution. The solution is to take my schedule and cram it into Jesus. So if I'm picking up my cross, what does it mean? It means self-denial. It means complete dedication. And then this third thing, it means willing obedience. Willing obedience. Jesus says this twice in the book of John 14:15, and weirdly, John 15:14. If you love me, you will obey my commandments. And then in 15:14, you are my friends if you do what I command you. Jesus could not be more clear about this. True friendship. You say, hey, Jesus is my friend. If Jesus is your friend, true friendship with him means that he's the priority of your life. And this is not the result of some warm, fuzzy, emotional feeling. Sometimes we think, Jesus is my friend, and I am emotionally feeling fuzzy good about that, No, true friendship and the priority of Jesus' relationship is doing the things that he commanded us to do. Living out his life principles that he teaches us in Scripture, which means, by the way, you got to know what they are. You got to be reading them. You got to be studying them. You got to be looking at those red words that's in the Gospels, okay, if you got a red letter edition, and then living them out. So let's be clear. If we're talking about making Jesus a priority, the way he puts it is you've got to pick up your cross and follow me daily. That means for us self-denial, complete dedication, and willing obedience. Now, once you know that, what I want to convince you of today, and we will see in the rest of this Luke 14 passage, is that my response then to Jesus' invitation daily to follow him, that response, both from the very beginning of when I begin my relationship with Jesus and on a daily basis as I follow him, that response, I'm convinced, should be rational, considered, and enlightened, as opposed to some emotional, naive, or foolish, fuzzy feeling. A lot of times, a lot of Christians get started on the wrong footing because of confusion about this, because of emotions. Now, I'm not taking anything away from emotions. I believe God is an emotional God. God gave us our emotions. I'm not saying you shouldn't plug those emotions in. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have this emotional response when you worship. Absolutely. What I am saying to you today is that if you choose to make Jesus your priority, if you choose to take up your cross and follow him, it's not ever going to be because you feel like it. It is going to be because of a rational, considered, thought out, enlightened choice. And I think we see in this passage 6 reasons why our choice for Jesus should be reasoned out, thought out. I want to challenge you with these 6 reasons of why. Let's get into it quickly. Reason number 1, so that my resolve to follow Jesus, my resolve will be examined. Jesus gives us a parable in verse 28. He says, suppose one of you wants to build a tower or a building or a house or anything. Any construction thing, all right? Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Will he not first sit down and estimate the cost to see if he has enough money to complete it? Deciding to make Jesus the priority of my life means that I know that this decision is going to cost me. I know I'm preaching words to you that, it's just not the favorite thing. You don't turn the TV on to hear a preacher tell you that. I may not know everything that's eventually going to cost me, but if I make a choice to follow Jesus, I go in this ahead of time knowing it's going to cost me. I may not know the whole deal, but I know it's going to cost me. And so I think about it. And when I think about it, I make the decision to choose Jesus as my number one priority anyway. Why? So that when trouble does come my way, I don't lose my resolve. How many people who think that they've chosen the Christian life, but I think really have not, have fallen away simply because no one has ever sat down with them and said to them, the Jesus way is a hard way. But that's the truth of the matter. We don't do anyone any favors. Parents, you're leading your children spiritually. We don't do anyone any favors by selling them Jesus as the answer to prosperity. Follow Jesus and your life will be better. Follow Jesus and you'll be healthier. Follow Jesus and you'll be wealthier. Yes, there are biblical principles that help us to live a healthier, wealthier, better, more prosperous life if we follow. But also, we need to know that history is filled. The first century Christians are filled with people who made the choice to follow Jesus, and it did cost them everything, including their lives. Every single one of the disciples was martyred. So maybe we need to start off by saying, look, I know this is going to cost me, and I am going to count the cost. And even though I may not know what the entire cost is, I choose to follow Jesus anyway. My resolve needs to be examined. Second reason why that we should reason this out, that our decision to follow Christ should be a rational one, is so that my reputation will be trusted. Oh, reputation, trusted. We go on in this parable in verse 29 and 30. For if he lays the foundation and he is not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule him, saying, this fellow began to build and was not able to finish. See, Jesus here is talking about reputation. And when you name yourself as a Christ follower, when you name yourself as a Christian, when you say to others that you are a disciple of Christ, and then you do things that hurt his reputation as well as yours, you hurt the reputation. It's important that we have a good reputation and that we maintain a good reputation for Jesus. Jesus tells us that when we come to him with our brains as well as with our hearts, when we come to him with a rational, considered, enlightened, thought-through choice, that we are more likely to keep Jesus as number one, that our resolve will be examined, that our reputation will be trusted. And reason number three, so that my resistance will be expected. So that resistance in my life will be expected. He goes on to another parable in verse 31. He says, or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Will he not first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? Now, why would Jesus use this parable about a king going to war? Because it speaks to this issue of opposition. Living the Jesus way means that you will encounter opposition. There will be a fight. Yes, a spiritual fight. A fight for your very soul. And then a fight for your effectiveness as a Christ follower. You see, we have an enemy who, first of all, would want to turn us against Christ, who, first of all, if he could, would like to steal us from Christ. But if he cannot do that, what he at least wants to make us is ineffective to reach anybody else for Christ. There's a spiritual battle. That's why we have the famous biblical passages from Paul about putting on the full armor of God, because Paul knew what this spiritual battle was like. Because this Christian walk that we're talking about here, and Jesus knew this, it's not a stroll in the park. It's dark, hard, spiritual battle. And if you have thought about this going into it, when you choose to follow Christ, then you expect the resistance that is sure to come. So, one reason is that our resolve would be examined. Another is that our reputation would be trusted. A third would be that our resistance would be expected. Now here, Jesus turns a corner. Your rational decision, your considered choice to follow Jesus, to take up your cross, this whole idea of self-denial, complete dedication, willing obedience, it's not just about you and your gritty determination. It's more than that. It's also, up front, a recognition of just how much you need God. That even in this rational, thought-out, non-emotional choice to follow Jesus, to take up my cross and follow him, to deny myself, to be completely dedicated, to understand this choice means to also realize my weaknesses and that I'm going to blow it and that I'm going to fail and that I desperately, desperately need God's help. So, reason number 4, so that my reliance on God will be presumed. We go to verse 32. Luke 14:32. Talking again about the king. If he is not able, in other words, he doesn't think he's going to win the battle, instead of taking his 10,000 and going up against 20,000 and for sure losing, he says if he is not able, what will he? He will send a delegation while the other is still a long way off and ask for terms of peace. You see, this is why whenever you have heard me lead people in the sinner's prayer, asking people, let me lead you in a prayer that invites Jesus into your heart, I always include this. I know I cannot do this on my own. I know I have blown it, maybe many times. God, will you help me? Will you give me the power of your Spirit and help me to rely upon you? You see, presuming a reliance on God to make Christ our first priority, that is rational. That is considered. That is enlightened, especially if you've ever tried to do this on your own, and you know how hard it is to do that, and you know that you need God's help. Some people consider failure in their life to simply be an emotional experience. Oh, I've blown it. I failed. Oh, I just feel so down and so bad about myself. And yes, failure can be very emotional. We've all failed, and we've all felt the oppression in our life because of our failure. It can be very emotional. But you also know, if you've ever been through the failure that ultimately has led to success, you also know that failure that leads to success is ultimately rational, considered, and enlightened. You know why? Because failure forces us to think through why it is that we have failed. What went wrong? I mean, it brings us to a point where we can honestly look at ourselves in the mirror and understand that we can't do it, or that we didn't do it, or that we should have done something different than what we did. And ultimately, I think we recognize our utter inability to live righteously the way that God has created us to live, we recognize our utter inability to carry out the commands of Christ that he has given us in his scripture. It brings us to a point where we have to fall at the throne of Jesus upon our knees and just say, God, I can't do this. Will you help me? And every time he answers with his Spirit and with his power in our life. And eventually we come to a point where we begin to rely upon his power rather than ourselves. It's a very difficult thing, especially if we are self-reliant, especially if we've come to depend upon ourselves, especially if we have this American feeling about pulling ourselves up by our own bootstraps, which, we all have, some of us more than others. To come to the point where we say, really, to be a good Christian, I have to admit that I can't be a good Christian. I just don't have it in me. That's the point where God begins to work. Notice in this passage in verse 32, while the other king is still a long way off. See, we can't decide at the last minute that we need God's power. We can't wait until we're at that point where we're going to fail. We can't wait till we're at the point where we're fighting this battle, whatever battle it might be. Maybe it's a battle of sin that wars against our Jesus prioritized life. We have to decide while the enemy is still a long ways off, that enemy is more powerful than my ability to fight. And so we need to go to God and say ahead of time, a long ways off, while the battle is not right in front of us, God, please give me your terms of peace. Because he will. Scripture is filled with the way that God grants peace to our life. 1 Corinthians 10:13 tells us that God is faithful, that he will provide a way out whenever we come up against a temptation or trial that we cannot handle. So, again, Jesus is talking about carrying the cross and what that means. And we've seen 4 reasons that our resolve will be examined, that our reputation will be trusted, that our resistance will be expected. We turn the corner and we find that we need reliance upon God and that's presumed going into this relationship. And then reason number 5, so that my relationship to God will be prioritized. Again, this is Jesus speaking in verse 33. In the same way, any of you who does not give up everything he has cannot be my disciple. Underline everything. Everything. Think about that. I mean, you really do have to think about this to understand it. You cannot give up what you don't consciously consider. You cannot hold back parts of your life from Jesus when you shine the enlightened meditation into the shadows of your life. And we don't often like to go there. We don't like to look for the shadows, the dark side of our life. Being a disciple of Jesus is such a privilege. Following Jesus and living for him is such a great opportunity. It is so rewarding for all of eternity, as we've looked at here. But Jesus, unlike many preachers of the word today, Jesus never soft pedals this truth. It's going to cost you everything you have. And I know it's hard for us to look at this full frontal face right there in front of us, but these are the words of Jesus to us. Jesus is not saying that we cannot love others or that we cannot have other priorities in our life. He's simply saying that he has to be the highest priority. Now, I want you to logically think this through for a moment. When you think of Jesus, the Son of God, could you ever think of Jesus as having a greater loyalty, a higher priority in his life to anyone other than God, his Father? Right? That makes sense to you, right? There's no higher priority in Jesus' life, the Son of God, than God the Father, right? We would all agree with that. And yet, Jesus also loves us so dearly, so much, that he gave his life for us. There is no greater love for any man than this. So, Jesus lives this out, and we follow that. So let's come back to those signs that I mentioned at the beginning of this sermon. Signs that Jesus may not be the highest priority in your life. Just challenge yourself with this. There are Jesus things and there are secular things, and I can keep them separate. No, you can't. There's just Jesus over and above everything. I might miss out on something if I make Jesus my highest priority. No, you won't. What you will miss out on if you don't make Jesus your highest priority is Jesus. Two people can share my highest loyalty, Jesus and. No, there's never Jesus and. It's Jesus only. When you say that, when you hear that in your head, whatever you fill the blank in with is that thing that you now must think about rationally, with consideration and with enlightenment, and then choose to follow Jesus. And then we will know, then you will know that Jesus is your highest priority. So reason 1, resolved, examined. Reason 2, reputation, trusted. Reason 3, resistance, expected. Reason 4, reliance on God, presumed. Reason 5, relationship to God, prioritized. And one final reason that will wrap us up today, so that my results for God will be savored. Some people wonder, where does this verse 34 come into play, and how does it fit with everything else? Salt is good. I mean, when did he start talking about salt? Did anybody else miss the transition there? Salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is fit neither for the soil nor for the manure power. It is thrown out. Some people think that maybe Jesus started another sermon. I don't. I think it fits right here. You see, there is nothing more worthless than unsalty salt. I am not a chemist. I'm not a scientist. But chemically, have you ever thought about this? How does salt become not salt? Salt is, according to the chemists, sodium chlorine, 2 elements. And the bond between sodium and chlorine is very tight. You see, they are very happy to share 1 electron. Am I saying that right? Right? They share 1 electron, so they stick together. They're bonded together. You can even dilute salt in water, and it will lose some of its effectiveness, but it's still salt inside the water. In order to be able to make salt not salt, you have to electrically charge it to break it up for salt to no longer be salt, for salt to become sodium and chlorine. Now, I want you to think about this for a moment. As a Christian, you too can become diluted, mixing in so many other priorities in your life that you lose effectiveness for Jesus. You're not going to stop being a Christian, just like that salt doesn't stop being a water. But you do have to start to think, am I going down a path that is irreversible in my life? Because eventually, just like that electric current, eventually the shock of other priorities can take over, so much so that maybe you were never really a Christ follower to begin with in the first place. And you question that. And no one, at least on this side of eternity, will really know the answer. Never lose your savor. Never lose your saltiness. I made it all the way through a sermon without one Greek reference, so I'm going to end with this. The verse here which says, lose your saltiness. Do you know what the Greek root word for that is? Moron. It's true. Moron. It's the word that we translate today for foolish. In other words, if you were to do anything else. You say you're a Christian, but you follow any other priorities in your life other than Jesus. Jesus is saying you've lost your saltiness. You've become a moron. You literally have lost your mind. And it's not worth it, folks. Let's always keep Jesus as number one.